Chapter 3, British North America. Though Chesapeake and New England colonists proudly considered themselves both English, the realities of the continent they inhabited made life in the colonies different and unique. America was a vast and untamed wilderness when compared to England, and increasingly populated by immigrants from all over the world. And yet it was still dominated by Native Americans, who were the most populous people on the continent until the late 17th century. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 back in England touched off democratic reforms at home and in these remote colonies, which later became more aligned with one another and became even more integral to the imperial aims of the English Protestant homeland. A second wave of English colonists came and reproduced quickly. The early growth of these colonies was less about immigration than a healthy population, at least in the North. Remember how many people died at Jamestown. Medicine was rudimentary and rooted in humorism. And though most people dealt with illness and medicine themselves or with the aid of a midwife. Still, as agricultural and imports improved, the population in the colonies doubled every 25 years, and 2 million English people called the colonies home by the start of the Revolution. Humorism will later kill George Washington. That is not to say the life in the colonies offered a common experience. Differences between the people of the North, New England, and the South, the Chesapeake, existed and included longer life expectancy in the North, the more distorted sex ratio in the South, differences in parenting styles even, and a stricter adherence to patriarchal Puritanism in the South. The system of American-style slavery that took root in these colonies was something new on the face of the globe, and it existed as a product of circumstances unique to its time and its place. War had previously offered the most common means for colonists to acquire enslaved slaves, in this instance, enslaved Native Americans, in the early days of colonial settlement. 17th century European legal thought held that enslaving prisoners of war was not only legal, but it was more merciful than killing the captives outright, which had been a prior practice. When demands of growing plantation economies required a more reliable labor force, the transatlantic slave trade of Africans to the New World rose to meet market demands. Southern and Caribbean planters had money but struggled to maintain control of a sufficient white labor force under tropical conditions. The first American slaves were purchased from older Spanish island plantations, slaves from the old trade who weren't necessarily African or black. As the sugar, tobacco, and rice industries boomed, American planters required more slaves than the Spanish could sell them. So they turned to the North African slave market trade directly. As demand for slaves in the Americas continued to increase, it became financially beneficial for slave traders to find more reasons to put more Africans into slavery. Slavers soon resorted to kidnapping people from neighboring African tribes in order to fill the orders placed by American planters and traders. The trade quickly devolved, and African slaves and whites worked together to capture free and innocent people, forcing them to take the Middle Passage, the terrible journey across the Atlantic, packed in ships like sardines, a journey marked by deadly dysentery, physical abuse, massive confusion, and death. Acculturation, or seasoning, as the last leg of their terrible journey soon followed. 11 million people were taken against their will to North and South America and Central America before the African slave trade would end. The slave trade was certainly affected by the laws of economics. Prices fell when competition for slave labor began in earnest in 1697, when the market rose to meet demand. It first became affordable, and only then did it become culturally permissible to own slaves in those English southern colonies as early as 1700. The number of slaves in the colonies soon exploded, up to 250,000 by 1760, and their legal status was initially very ambiguous. In the American South, slavehood quickly became permanent, and children inherited their parents' bondage. That's what makes it new on the global stage. This arrangement was made legal when colonial assemblies began to pass slave codes that used color to mark status. Whites were universally free. Blacks in these colonies were permanent servants by virtue of their race. For African slaves and their families, the only way out of forced labor was death. Francis Lejeune, who baptized and ministered to the slaves, did so without permission of slave masters, many of whom feared Christian baptism was a slippery slope to emancipation. While hundreds of thousands of blacks were being forced to the Americas, an equal number of Europeans were arriving of their own volition. The most distinctive and enduring feature of the American population is that it is comprised by a diversity of races, nationalities, and ethnicities, and is still true today. Huguenots, French Calvinists, German Protestants, Palatinates, the Pennsylvania Dutch, German Mennonites, Scotch-Irish, and other Scottish and Irish immigrants arrived by the tens of thousands in the 18th century. These people came to America to escape religious persecution, but they also came for more recognizable problems like unemployment and the high price of rent. Economics in the American coastal South, or the Chesapeake, took on distinctive patterns in the 18th century. The southern agricultural economies of Maryland, Virginia, were both prone to boom and bust due to unpredictable and uneven tobacco production. South Carolina and Georgia became heavily reliant on rice production. These cash crops and raw production soon became the name of the game in the Chesapeake. Plantation life in the Chesapeake was precarious and tumultuous for even its white owners. As plantations grew in size, black society, culture, and religion found expression, though slaves often found themselves at the mercy of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse common on many southern plantations. Across New England, the soil and the climate were not favorable for growing crops as they were in the South, so a commerce economy took shape instead. Fur trappers, metal workers, miners, blacksmiths, bankers, cobblers, rifle makers, millers, printers, and shipbuilders took root across the Northeast. Businesses that utilized and exploited natural resources like animal furs, wood, minerals, fishing, created a commercial middle class unique to these northern colonies. Rhode Island and the Providence plantations took strides toward egalitarianism and tolerance by abolishing witchcraft trials, by abolishing and getting rid of imprisonment for debt, and by 1652 getting rid of slavery. While Pennsylvania's Quakers, the Quakers their colony to pacifism and unity, seeking to create a new heaven on earth. Cities of New England included Philadelphia, New York City, with a population of 25,000 people, which began to exist as urban centers of commerce, crime, imported goods, traffic, and intellectualism, building the intellectual roots of the coming political revolution. For most colonists, poverty and isolation were early markers of their colonial experience. Lack of access to commercial markets meant few pots, few candles, few wagons, few roads connecting rural colonial communities. The myth of colonial self-sufficiency, though, is challenged by realities and sober historical reflection. Few families made their own clothes in this era, and most relied on imported and manufactured goods, no matter how pricey. Obstacles to trade and commerce were incredible. No ready currency existed, and gold and silver were rare, so bartering and the trade of beaver skins and other commodities made the economy work. Trade between the West Indies, Caribbean islands, and England, and Europe, and West Africa created a sort of triangular trade system whereby Caribbean sugar went to New England, up, and was distilled into rum, and then colonial rum, furs, and natural resources were funneled to Africa and to Europe in exchange for slaves and manufactured goods, which came to the Americas. In New England, communities were built to be neighborly, featuring annual town meetings and an equalizing practice called anti-primogeniture, whereby inheritance of the deceased parents spread among sons instead of just to the eldest, meant to diversify power and prevent the concentration of wealth and land that had plagued Europe for decades. Tensions flared up, though, when sons who stood to inherit very little simply moved to organize new communities. Anxieties over religion and gender roles in New England led to repeated witchcraft scares, preoccupation over Satan's influence, and other forms of religious extremism. 20 men and women were executed in and around Salem, Massachusetts at the end of the 17th century. The causes of the trials may have included local rivalries, Political turmoil, faulty legal procedure, whereby accusing others became a method of self-defense, and perhaps even low-level environmental contamination of their stored foods. Enduring tensions with Indians frame the events, however, and an Indian or African woman named Tituba, enslaved by the local minister, was at the center of the tragedy. As differences between the New England and Chesapeake colonies solidified, an emerging conflict between the traditional personal God and the Enlightenment ideals of science and human reason played out in America in a way unlike anywhere else on the planet. From the get-go, American colonial churches and faiths coexisted, changed, and multiplied, putting tolerance of difference at a premium in the colonies. Catholics and Jews, though, were often denied voting rights and political rights across some of the colonies. Western migrations, though, continually split up churches and made the declension of religious piety a perceived problem across New England. Church leaders were continuously worried that colonists were losing their faith or would lose their faith. Bacon's rebellion was a backcountry rebellion in Virginia politics and an early expression of American hostility to traditional English patterns of aristocracy. And now an effort, unaided by the colony's English governor, to displace and fight back against raids by a group of Doge Indians threatened the legitimacy of the colony's unrepresentative government. It expressed frustration, Bacon's rebellion, on the part of colonists unable to shape colonial decisions and unwilling to draw lines between native and colonial territory. Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion is an example of the continuing problem of defining white and native spheres in the New World, specifically England's inability to do so. Just a few years after Bacon's rebellion, the Spanish experienced their own tumults in the area of contemporary New Mexico. The Spanish had been maintaining control partly by suppressing Native American beliefs. Catholic friars aggressively enforced Catholic practices, burning native idols and mass and other sacred objects, and banishing traditional spiritual practices. In 1680, the Puebloan religious leader Pope, who had been arrested and whipped for sorcery 5 years earlier, led various Puebloan groups in rebellion in New Mexico. Several thousand Puebloan leaders raised the Spanish countryside and besieged Santa Fe. They killed 400, including 21 Franciscan priests, and allowed 2,000 other Spaniards and Christian Puebloans to flee. It is perhaps the greatest act of indigenous resistance in North American history. It began to signal the decline of Spanish power in the American continent. As the Spanish Empire began to lose its grip on the New World, England seized it. Increased immigration and booming land speculation on the western edge of the colonies ceaselessly increased white demand for Indian lands. Coercive and fraudulent methods of negotiation became increasingly prominent. The infamous walking purchase of 1737 was emblematic of both colonists' desire for cheap land and the unbalanced relationship between white colonists and their native neighbors. The 14-month King Philip's War in 1675 began by the Wampum people, led by Metacom. The Massachusetts settlers was the first formal conflict between the Old and the New World on the North American continent, and it introduced flintlock muskets by both sides, foreshadowing future conflicts and bloodshed between natives and English settlers. That was very quick. In summary, with Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War, the story is not necessarily the fighting between the white colonists and the native groups. The real story is the English government's inability to deal with either group's set of grievances. Natives are frustrated that whites are on their land and continually picking fights with them and trying to take their land. The English colonists are frustrated that natives are in their way, and more importantly, that they are the ones having to fight these natives and not the official British military. So after Bacon's Rebellion, the transplanted, wealthy, and political elites sent to the American colonies to govern understood that they needed to control their free, white, politically unrepresented workers, many of whom had come as indentured servants. But they lacked the infrastructure and systems to do so, to actually hold control, to have any power. And they didn't want to cede what little power they had. They thought that perhaps more African slaves purchased from the Caribbean sugar colonies could fill the need for manual labor on the mainland and pose less risk to the order and hierarchy of colonization. Though English colonists certainly shared values with and remained connected to their brothers in England, American colonists in the 17th century had grown accustomed to limited expressions of self-government, often without English parliamentary oversight. Social mobility became a marker of American life, the ability to start poor and make something for yourself. The class system of England failed to entrench itself in these colonies, and white people found real economic opportunity in the colonies, though often at the expense of others and often natives. When England later began to tighten its grip on the people of the colonies, these English citizens, an imperial identity crisis would threaten.